Hey there, friends. Happy St. Patrick's Day, or St. Patty's Day, as they say. Shout out to Earlham College, because I have their cup. My daughter went there, and of course, I raided the gift shop for cups and shirts. Speaking of shirts, thank you, Melody. This is so beautiful. I haven't even put it on yet. It's a Ganesh shirt. Hope I get that right for the camera there. We have a Ganesh over at Glenn's apartment, which is where I left the hat. In the last exciting episode, I didn't have my hat. I was hatless. Let's see, pictures. I should pull up Flickr. What this particular video is about is Archimedes, what we could call solids, but shapes, and kind of lingering sense of Pi Day. Since today is what, March 17th? Well, March 14th was Pi Day, and I let it go by without so much as a mention. So I'm making up for that. Lots of pie in this particular picture. What I don't really have, though, are all the right shapes to be pouring my green liquid, right? St. Patrick's Day, I should be pouring something green. As you remember, I think from the last video, if you watched it, and these are out of sequence, you could say, or no special sequence. Except that's not quite true. I linked them together. I kind of blockchain them. And so there is a sequence, but I am very mindful of how browsing works and how people just dive bomb in. So, or just visit out of nowhere as strangers. So I do have that in mind, and I plan to enlighten anybody who's new here. We do have links to Subgenius. Thank you, Trevor, for the up to date literature. I still feel included. We've been doing some stuff on Discordians. Where has that been happening? I've been. I do circle back to the JFK era. Like I came to consciousness in the 50s, but very late 50s. You could say the 60s. I started tracking, and the assassination of President Kennedy was one of the first things that really hit me at what's going on globally. Like, here's the big news, right? Here's the big story. Here's the real stuff. And of course, that makes an impression, even though if I was just what, second grade or something like that. So, Kerry Thornley's his story, and my friend David and I, Koski, he's going to be part of this talk. We both read some of the same stuff and compare notes and so on. And Kerry Thornley helped start the Discordians in some way, which is kind of like making fun of, in a way, paranoias, because he thought, Kerry did, that the bigger enemy than actual cabals and actual conspiracies are the many nightmarish conspiracies and cabals that don't exist but that we imagine exist and torture ourselves and torment ourselves about, and that this can lead to as much sort of destruction or damage to the psyche as anything real. Our fantasy life. Interesting thesis. How he carried it out in person. I mean, what he did, and it's not. I'm not going to get into in this video. What I want to get into instead is Archimedean stuff, and what I don't have, I was going to say, is exactly the shapes to pour one into the other. Like if I were going to do the St. Patrick's thing, I would have green water, right? Or something green. You remember in the last video, like I say, you might not remember, I was pouring from a wine bottle, because it's nice and red, into a tetrahedron, which we could say is unit volume. I'm going to make that dry inside, because let's pour the balls back in. These are little space. We're going to get balls pouring back into the tetrahedron. And it should fill it exactly because there's just enough. Whoops, one on the floor. This is tricky. Oh man, it's going to be hard to get these perfect. 2 fell, 3 fell. Okay, I better cut my losses here for a minute. And hey, there's a lot of green in that. Okay, I forgot about that. So happy St. Patrick's Day. There's our ritual moment. And I feel like the wine is kind of referencing all Catholic kind of mass and everything. So without being too blasphemous or anything. But I want to talk about, by the way, shout out to the Pope and Ayatollah Sistani for getting it together there. We don't really need political theater all by itself, right? This is the equations that we're looking at today. Um, so I'm banned off of Facebook, by the way, for like 3 days. I just double tested that, but I knew it was going to be that way. I wrote testing and it's circled in red. Something's wrong. I do use a Bob Dobbs avatar. I said something about stupid Brits because I'm tired of Russophobia fomented deliberately and the stuff that went on in Syria there around the white helmets and the triggering of the missile attack in April of 2018. I was very fussed about it then and continue to be, and I follow the story and it's on Facebook. But I said something juvenile about stupid Brits. Not showing here, I guess, but oh, there's something about it. MI6 hasn't been performing well in recent episodes. That's just my personal opinion. And so for the next 3 days, I guess we're down to maybe 2.5. I'm not going to be posting to Facebook, and that's probably just as well. Too much time goes down the drain, but I really appreciate being in touch with people. So the ratios 1, 3, 4, 6 are what we're going to look at. Let's jump over to REPL IT and check Archimedes, which is one I just developed to remind myself of this. See, in the curriculum that we use here, the Bucky Fuller curriculum, informed by Bucky Fuller, it's informed by many sources. That's what this channel has been about a lot. And Fuller acknowledges he was, influenced by many forces, or persons, or scenarios. It's a very comprehensive curriculum, but let's start with the concentric hierarchy as usual, hierarchy. Like we have this cube, which we call volume 3, relative to a unit volume tetrahedron, such as we could call this, and the relationship is face diagonals to edge. So we call this 1. And we have a pretty interesting math about how we can do that and still have edges 1, right? There's a consistency here that it's not been developed by lots and lots of people, because this math, I have to say, is somewhat verboten, somewhat suppressed. Go look at math journals, go look at MIT Technology Review, and see if you can find a good write-up, right? See if this isn't underground, right? They'll say things like, Bucky popularized the jitterbug, as if other people were really into it and he just came along and noticed and popularized it, right? Jitterbug transformation. So I don't have the right things to pour. So we have this, right, volumes 1, rhombic dodecahedron 6, space filler, could surround each one of these little balls if you made it smaller, and the cube of 3, and so on and so forth. But what I want to talk about is the cone, the sphere, and the cylinder. And this was something that Archimedes was really into. And they're usually shown the same way, side by side, and the cone, they make the same height as the cylinder into which the sphere fits, because that's the narrative, right? It's like if you plunk this sphere into this cylinder, you're going to find out the volume ratio of the two is like 4 to 6 or 2 to 3, and that the ratio of the cone to the cylinder it's inscribed in is going to be 1 to 3. But I think an easier, maybe more informative set of steps is to start with what I'll call the drum, which is half of that cylinder. So the full cylinder we're going to talk about is containing a sphere, right? See the red ball here and the purple sphere. I'm just coasting around through all the millions of pictures that images pops up here. And so start with half of that cylinder and half of the sphere, and you can kind of relate it to how the tetrahedron is a third of the cube. The cone inside of that half cylinder or drum is going to be, think of as our tetrahedron, a volume, say 1. And it's, you can adjust the volume to whatever you want. Forget about edge lengths and R for now. So say the cone is 1 inside of this half cylinder, then the half sphere, the hemisphere, is going to have volume 2. It's twice that of the cone, and the cylinder itself is going to have volume 3, which is kind of like the relationship of the tetrahedron to the cube. So this is mnemonics. It'll help you remember. Remember how in the concentric hierarchy, the ratio here of tetrahedron to cube is 1 to 3. Think of that as cone to drum. Think of 2 drums, the half cylinders, as being 6, like the rhombic dodecahedron, and that will remind you of the full cylinder into which we put the sphere, and think of the sphere as 4, the octahedron. Okay, those will be the volumes that you'll want to remember. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. Except now we'll go to equations. These really, when you're computing them in textbooks, they derive all in terms of pi, what these would be. And in terms of synergetics, this is a really good place to remind you of the synergetics constant. More technically, it's called S3, not with a superscript 3, but just 3 the same size as the S. And this stands for the synergetics constant. And it's what we do when we change our definition of a unit of volume. We keep the same, as you saw last time, mathematics of multiplication of 3 edges of our reference shape, just like we do with a cube or a rectilinear coordinate system. In a rectilinear coordinate system, stand it up on a corner like this and think of how these 3 vectors come out at 90 degrees to one another, and you pick 3 lengths, multiply them together. But then you do more than close the lid. You close the lid and then build a reflection of that same tetrahedron above itself, and you get a rectilinear prism. And that you call the volume of these 3 lengths, of any length, right? They're going to define a parallelepiped, which is composed of close the lid and flip it over, basically double it, so that you get a rectangular shape. Now, in Fuller's math, or synergetics, we would start with this unit of volume. You can multiply again the 3 rays together. Could use quad rays for this. I'll explain those in other videos. And close the lid, and there's your volume. So if I do 2 times 3 times 3, that's 9 times 4. 2 times 2 times 3. I'm always messing this up. Say 18. Then you close the lid, and that's your volume 18. By close the lid, I mean you connect the endpoints of those 3 vectors, and that is your volume of 18. You don't do any kind of doubling, and it doesn't start out. These are wider angles when you do it in the XYZ way, the way we all learn in school. We don't teach this other stuff. This alternative paradigm, like I say, is kind of verboten. And the World Game Museum, you just go back and look at all the texts and papers, and I think we can document, right, that there's been a withholding of this information, which I, don't want to keep. I don't want to be part of that, right? I'm not going to condemn myself to that, level of ignorance or whatever I did. Try to let you in on these things, right, instead of suppressing them. So because of that relationship, difference in how we compute or demonstrate volume when we multiply and third power and so forth, because 2 times 2 times 2 is a tetrahedron for us. Well, that changes the, you have to go between XYZ and IVM, you need to multiply the XYZ volume by the second root of 9/8, because the unit cube's a little bit bigger than the unit tetrahedron. How we relate them is we say that the unit cube, the one we use in XYZ, we'll say that has edges R, right? Unit. And the tetrahedron is going to have edges D, double R. And yet it's still a slightly smaller volume, right? 0.9 something, right? Compute that. So that's our constant, like a conversion constant between two currencies. And that's what's going on. I use this messy or handwritten stuff I type it in basically to a computer. And here, if I run this code with those same formulas, I get two columns, the XYZ volume and the IVM volume. But what's kind of useful to see is how it's just using very simple relationships that Archimedes discovered and proved. In other words, a hemi is just two cones, a hemisphere. And the drum is just a half cylinder, but it's also three cones. So when I get to that cylinder, I multiply it by, to get the cylinder, what I call the cylinder, the tall cylinder in which the sphere fits, I multiply two drums and so on. So very simple relationships. And there's the synergetics constant, square root of 9/8 is one way to put it. Now, a cool thing to do is, like, let's take the volume, the IVM volume of the sphere, which I call ball. Let's say SPH equals ball, radius 1, and IVM equals true. We want the IVM volume. So it's not going to be quite the same because of our synergetics constant. But if you divide 6, which is the space filler surrounding every IVM ball, every sphere in the CCP, every sphere in the sphere packing of space here, densest sphere packing. Like, there are other sort of variants of the CCP that have the same density, but what is that density? Of empty space to filled space. So think of a rhombic dodecahedron with a ball inside, tangent to the 12 faces. What's the ratio of filled space to empty space? And we have a nice volume here for the rhombic dodecahedron, 6. And I've just shown you what the new sphere volume would be. Square root, or second root, I don't know if I have to say square, but second root of 2 times pi times r to the third power, instead of 4/3, right? It still comes out kind of nice. It still has pi in it. It's still pretty simple. So the formula is, whoops, other way around. Wait, it's not right. The density, how much of the sphere compared to the empty space around it, see, I did it reciprocally, is 0.740480, like that. You can look that number up as the density of the CCP. We agree, basically, XYZ and IVM, we get the same answers and so on. It's consistent to have these parallel volumes and use them, their ratios in the concentric hierarchy, that is, also to help anchor, solidify, or what should we call it, the mnemonic power, the memory power. Uh-oh, here comes my flash. Remind me later, and it's going to take me to a web page. Very annoying, right? Adobe. Anyway, well, I lost my train of thought there. So you want to take your understanding of the concentric hierarchy and map that to the Archimedean stuff. these ratios to help them anchor in your mind, right? And you don't really, it's the ratios that matter, right? And so we're keeping our Western heritage, and we'll go from here to the Antikythera, the navigation and cosmology device, talk about really how advanced the civilization, the Mediterranean civilization, had become by the time of Archimedes. Get back on our timeline, in other words, and roll forward, roll backward. Neolithic math is into the past, Martian math into the future, and then we've got supermarket math and casino math. If you're interested in all that, check the previous video. Thank you, David Koski, for these conversations that help me glue these things together in my own mind. I heard from a Burning Man guy recently. He was into these ratios himself to some level, and that kind of triggered me to um, pull this blog post into the present and remind students of the possibilities here. Now, again, we're not abandoning or turning our back on XYZ or anything. It's so easy and so natural to just keep using what we've already learned. So this is not let's be militant and throw out XYZ. It's more like people are always asking, like Chris Hedges, don't you have any hope? Or, what can we do? And it's always like mass movements and stuff like that. And I'm saying, well, there's also the curriculum to think about, and CP Snow Chasm, and like bridging the gap, which I think we're doing here, starting from the humanities. We have our values and our morals and our ethics. We didn't give those up, and we come across the bridge into STEM, newly equipped, I'd say, with some interesting concepts. And once here in the political theater, right, we're not necessarily nationalists in the same way. I'm a big fan of what I call virtual nations, diaspora nations, kind of ghostly nations, which fades over into corporations, really. Global entities that don't require large contiguous land masses to define themselves. You can have a network of campuses around the world and be a corporation and really have as much power as most nations or more, right? So the idea of global institutions, in other words, on the world or planted on the earth, equals global, that are quasi nations, I would say that's something I've got more room for than most nationalists. And yet I'm talking about more nations, not less, right? More acceptance of virtual nations. So my anti-nationalism, I would say, is somewhat nuanced. But again, it goes back to Fuller having a nationalist map and feeling like even in the 40s and so on, he could see with the emergence of technology as it is that this idea of keeping people all separated and thinking what governments think they should think based on their geographic location, that's just not going to work. That's going to break down pretty quickly, especially with so-called social media. But it's not a crisis for him. And it's interesting that someone who wins the Medal of Freedom can declare the USA we have known bankrupt and extinct way back in the 80s. And you got people like Chomsky and Chris Hedges and so on who never mention this, never talk about it, seem to have no knowledge of these topics, which is something I don't want to replicate that mistake in the sense that I will read and listen to lots of these guys. Like last night, I fell asleep listening to Chris Hedges again. Actually, to Ian McEwan, but Politics After Trump, conversation with Chris Hedges. Always goes to the same point towards the end. Don't you have any hope? Or what do you do around hope? And I'm saying, well, one thing you can do around hope is pay attention to your own heritage, especially probably the best futurists the Americans ever had, and capitalize, right? on that knowledge. All right. Talk to you soon.